Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Today, we're returning to a story that changed how America thinks about schools, safety, and secrecy: the Columbine High School Massacre, April 20, 1999. This episode isn't about sensational details. It's about questions that remain, the people who still carry the weight, and the systems that failed them. With me is Dr. Caleb Morrison, a forensic psychologist who has spent years studying the perpetrators' writings and advising on threat assessments. Caleb, thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. It's heavy to talk about, but necessary. I appreciate the care you bring to this.
Let's start where a lot of narratives do. Columbine as a quiet, middle-class suburban high school. For most Americans before 1999, Columbine was anonymous. It was the kind of place people imagined was safe. That contrast, normal school, extraordinary violence, shaped the national shock. Caleb, why is that context important?
Because context shapes expectation. People assumed schools were insulated from mass violence, the suburban myth of safety. When the unimaginable happened in a place that looked ordinary, it ruptured assumptions. It also made the search for a single cause more urgent and more tempting. If this happened in normal suburban America, then what in our culture or systems allowed it?
Right, and that search produced lots of stories, some accurate, some not. Before we dig into myths, we need to be clear on the basic facts. Two seniors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, arrived on April 20 with bombs and guns. The plan, as investigators reconstructed, was primarily a bombing aimed at the cafeteria during lunch, designed to produce mass casualties. That plan failed when the bombs didn't detonate. What does that failure tell us, Caleb?
It tells us two things. One, they were prepared to commit mass murder on a scale far beyond what a spontaneous shooting would suggest. So this was a planned, calculated attack. Two, contingencies matter in these events. When a key element failed, the perpetrators adapted. They moved from bombing to shooting, and the violence unfolded differently than they'd initially intended. Psychologically, that shift also reveals something about intent. Their objective wasn't just to hurt a few people. They aimed for large numbers and, frankly, notoriety.
Notoriety. That thread runs through a lot of what people call the motive equation: grievance, revenge, a desire to be remembered. Before the shooting, both boys had social lives, jobs at Blackjack Pizza, classmates, projects. But they also left a paper trail, a website with threats, home videos, the so-called basement tapes, and a criminal incident in '98 involving a break-in that landed them a juvenile diversion program. Caleb, you've read their writings. How do those materials complicate the simple narrative of bullied outsiders?
They complicate it a lot. The bullying narrative is emotionally compelling. It's simple and offers a clear villain, but the evidence shows a much messier psychological landscape. Eric's writings show planning, grandiosity, and a lack of empathy, traits psychologists associate with psychopathy. Dylan's journals show profound depression, self-loathing, suicidal ideation. Together, you get a dynamic where one seems more ideologically driven toward domination and destruction, while the other may have been pulled in by despair and a desire to end his own life alongside causing harm. Bullying may have been a piece of their lived experience, but it doesn't explain everything.
So, to be precise, bullying is not exculpatory, but it's not sufficient as a single explanatory factor. I want to pause on a detail that's been central in later investigations: the Harris website and that unexecuted affidavit. A neighbor, Brooks Brown's mother, reported the site and its threats to the sheriff's office more than a year before the shooting. An affidavit was drafted but never served. Later, families alleged documents were hidden or destroyed. Caleb, from a prevention perspective, how significant is that missed opportunity?
It's potentially huge. If a search warrant had been executed and evidence of bomb-making and explicit threats found, investigators might have been able to remove weapons, confiscate explosive materials, or at least place them under more scrutiny. That could have disrupted months of preparation. Now, important caveat, we can't say with certainty it would have prevented the attack, but failing to pursue credible warnings cost the community something: information and a chance. Systemic failures to follow up on leads are a recurring theme in these tragedies.
Which brings us to a recurring question of this episode. Could Columbine have been prevented? We'll return to that later. For now, let's walk through the day minute by minute, because the timeline exposes crucial decisions and the human cost of delayed action. I'll read a condensed reconstruction, and Caleb, jump in with observations as we go. At about 11:10 a.m., both boys arrive on campus carrying duffel bags containing propane bombs and weapons. Around 11:14, a custodian is changing a security tape, which later complicates what video evidence shows. They place the bombs in the cafeteria and head back to their cars to gear up. Their devices fail to detonate at 11:17.
That failure is the pivot. Had the bombs detonated, the casualty profile would likely have been much higher. The fact they didn't tells us their engineering work was imperfect, but they'd clearly invested time in learning how to assemble devices. Someone could have noticed gas smells or components at home, and yet investigators later found these devices in their cars and homes without earlier detection.
At roughly 11:19, they open fire outside the west entrance. A student, Rachel Scott, is killed while sitting on the grass. They then enter the school and begin shooting into hallways, throwing pipe bombs, and moving to the library by about 11:29. Dave Sanders, a beloved teacher, spends hours helping students and is shot while directing others to safety. He survives for some hours in a science classroom, tended by students, but dies before medical teams reach him. We'll come back to that. Caleb, at what point does law enforcement's training become an active variable in how many lives were lost?
Pretty early. The initial officers arrived and, consistent with then standard training for barricade or hostage situations, adopted a contain and wait approach. They were trained to form perimeters and wait for specialized units because entering an open, active scene carried perceived risks: secondary devices, ambushes, hostages. That training shaped their posture. In hindsight, it's clear that aggressive intervention, officers moving toward gunfire, could have altered outcomes. But you have to evaluate officers in the context of the doctrine they'd been taught at the time. Columbine changed that doctrine.
And quickly after Columbine, policing shifted to an active shooter model, training officers to move toward the sound of shots. But that change came after lives were lost. Let's linger on the library, because it's where the worst single concentration of deaths occurred. From about 11:29 to 11:36, students were following 911 instructions: hide under tables, stay quiet. The shooters moved methodically through the library, taunting and firing. 10 of the 13 victims killed that day died in the library. Witness reports include taunts about religious belief, remember the Cassie Bernal story that later was contested, and slurs. Caleb, what does the library scene tell us about motive and opportunity?
It shows methodical cruelty and a mix of targeted and random violence. They asked questions in some accounts, and in others they fired without preamble. The mythologized "Do you believe in God?" exchange became a symbol, powerful but likely inaccurate in its particulars. What's important is the pattern. They sought maximum terror and maximum coverage, moving through a place where people were concentrated and vulnerable. The blend of planning and improvisation makes motive complex. There's ideological hatred in some of their language, personal grievances in others, and a clear desire for mass death and infamy.
We need to stress victims' humanity here. When we talk about tactics and motives, we cannot lose sight of the students who were in that library. People hiding under tables, listening to classmates' cries, playing dead among bodies. Survivors report long-term trauma, PTSD, chronic physical injury, survivor guilt. That dimension often gets lost in the analytic rush to find causes. Caleb, in your work, how do survivors' accounts help or complicate our understanding of what happened?
Survivors' narratives are invaluable for reconstructing the experience, but they also reflect trauma's impact on memory. High stress can fragment recall, change timelines, and create inconsistencies. So discrepancies across accounts don't mean someone is lying. They mean trauma does what trauma does. That said, survivors provide sensory detail and lived truth about fear, choices made in the moment, and long-term consequences. Their stories are the moral center of any analysis.
Which takes us to Dave Sanders again. He became a lightning rod for questions about police tactics because students tried to flag help writing "one bleeding to death" in a window, and yet Sanders didn't receive definitive medical attention when he might have had time. Caleb, we talked earlier about doctrine. Do you think a more aggressive policy at the time would have saved Dave Sanders?
It's possible. Some medical experts and peers argue that quicker access might have changed the outcome. But again, the officers believed there were bombs and booby traps. There were, indeed, explosive devices in the building, many of which had failed, but still presented a perceived risk. That risk influenced command decisions. Whether those decisions were reasonable under then-current training versus morally right in the moment is the center of the debate. Families understandably feel outraged, and those feelings are warranted.
Anger is warranted. I've interviewed families who say the delay was an avoidable tragedy. There are also allegations, more than allegations, documented instances of withheld documents and an affidavit regarding Harris's website that never got executed and later seemed to vanish from files. After the massacre, journalists and families accused law enforcement of misrepresenting timelines and of destroying or withholding materials, including the basement tapes, most of which were reportedly destroyed in 2011. Caleb, how does this opacity affect both truth-seeking and healing?
Openness is essential for trust and for answering, could this have been prevented? When records are missing or materials are destroyed, it creates a void that conspiracy and suspicion readily fill. Destroying the basement tapes was defended as preventing copycats and protecting victims from re-traumatization, but it also removed primary source material that historians, psychologists, and the public could have analyzed. That loss hinders closure and fuels the sense of a hidden truth, that there are things we should know but can't.
People often ask whether releasing everything would have risked inspiring copycats. There's a real tension between public knowledge, forensic investigation, and the danger of creating a macabre shrine. But we must be honest, the destruction of primary evidence complicates accountability. Let's shift now to motives and myths, because Columbine became an origin story for a moral panic about video games, music, Marilyn Manson was scapegoated, and trench coat myths. Caleb, where did that come from?
When people are searching for causes, they look for simple culprits: violent games, provocative music, or a subculture. The trench coat mafia narrative fit a pattern: paint the shooters as outsiders influenced by a fringe culture. But later research shows the pair had friends, participated in school projects, and weren't leaders of an organized violent clique. As for media influences, the science is complex. There is no clear, direct causal chain from playing Doom to committing murder. More often, media provides a language or script for pre-existing violent fantasies. Blaming music or games is emotionally satisfying, but often misleading.
There's also the psychological split you mentioned. Eric often described as having psychopathic traits, Dylan as deeply depressed and suicidal. The question, who was pulling home, remains open. Did Eric drag Dylan into a plan Dylan would not have conceived alone? Or were they co-architects with different emphases?
Most likely, they were co-conspirators with an imbalance of roles. Eric's journals and behavior suggest he was the planner and ideological driver. Dylan's writings read as more despairing, with moments of narcissistic resentment. In partnerships like this, you often see a dynamic where one person accelerates a tragic plan, while the other, driven by self-destructive urges, participates. It's not simple hero and henchman binary, but an interdependent, dangerous pairing.
That interdependence, paired pathology, helps explain some things, but not everything. Another major aftermath thread: legal and policy changes. There were criminal convictions of people who supplied guns, Mark Maines, Philip Duran, civil settlements with victims' families, and a national shift in law enforcement policy toward active shooter responses. But gun laws remained uneven. Caleb, do you see Columbine's legacy more in policing doctrine or in broader public policy?
Both, but more immediately in policing doctrine. Columbine was the inflection point for training officers to rush toward gunfire, creating a procedural norm that arguably saved lives in some later incidents. In public policy, it catalyzed debates about zero-tolerance policies, school resource officers, measures to harden schools, but it didn't produce uniform federal gun safety legislation. So the legacy is patchwork: tactical change on the ground, fragmented policy responses in the wider political arena.
And those policy choices have consequences. Schools became more locked down, surveillance increased, and zero-tolerance policies proliferated. Critics argue that made schools feel like prisons and pushed normal adolescent behavior into criminal pipelines. Supporters say it made schools safer. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Caleb, what do threat assessments do today that would have mattered in 1999?
Contemporary threat assessments are more multidisciplinary and proactive. They emphasize behavioral indicators over single-factor explanations, encourage reports from peers and family members, and use teams to evaluate risk and intervene with mental health supports. In 1999, systems were less integrated and diversion programs could be gamed. Today, the hope is that a multi-tiered approach, school staff, mental health professionals, law enforcement, can identify escalating risk earlier. Yet, the reality is resource constraints and privacy concerns often limit implementation.
Which brings us back again to the question, could Columbine have been prevented? We have fragments that suggest missed opportunities, a reported website with threats, the juvenile diversion program outcome, friends and acquaintances who saw worrying behavior. But we lack a definitive, if this had been done, the attack would not have happened answer. That uncertainty is one of the reasons this story remains still unanswered. Let's talk about victims and survivors. The official death toll was 13 victims, 12 students and 1 teacher, plus the 2 perpetrators. 20 people were wounded by gunfire, 3 injured while fleeing. Since then, 1 survivor, Anne Marie Hochhalter, died in 2025 from complications related to injuries. That long arc of harm underscores that the consequences didn't end on April 20. Survivors report decades of therapy, chronic pain, and disrupted lives. Caleb, what long-term mental health consequences do mass shootings leave behind?
Long-term consequences are profound. Chronic PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance misuse, social withdrawal, and survivor's guilt. For those physically injured, chronic pain and disability intertwine with mental health, amplifying suffering. Families of victims carry ambiguous loss. Communities suffer civic trauma, a fraying of trust. The health burden is multi-generational and often under-resourced. That's why prevention is as much about long-term public health investment as immediate policing.
And memorialization is part of healing, but it's complicated. The library was demolished and replaced by an atrium. A Hope Columbine Memorial Library opened, and a Clement Park Memorial was dedicated in 2007. Some families wanted public remembrance, others wanted privacy. Cultural representations, books, films, documentaries also play a role. They can humanize victims, but they can re-traumatize families if handled poorly. Caleb, do you think media coverage has gotten better at handling these events?
In some respects, yes. There is more sensitivity now about not giving perpetrators sensational coverage that could inspire copycats, and many outlets foreground victims and survivors. Yet the media ecosystem also contains forums that glorify shooters. Social platforms can amplify dangerous idolization. Responsible journalism tries to balance truth-telling with ethical restraint, but commercial incentives sometimes push toward lurid storytelling. So improvement is uneven.
That brings up the phenomenon of Columbiners, online communities that fetishize the shooters, exchange artifacts, and even create fan art. Multiple later shooters have referenced Columbine explicitly. That contagion effect was part of why authorities destroyed some materials and were cautious about releases. But destroying evidence also erases historical context. Caleb, from a forensic standpoint, how do you weigh the risk of contagion against the value of transparency?
It's a trade-off with no perfect answer. Transparency aids research and accountability. Restriction may reduce the risk of inspiration. Best practice leans toward releasing factual, redacted materials to support scholarship and victim needs while avoiding lurid dissemination of manifestos or explicit instructional content. Containment strategies also include removing heroic framing and emphasizing consequences and harm. It's a nuanced editorial and legal judgment.
Let's surface some of the core, still unanswered questions for our listeners. Questions we want to hold with gravity, not tidy conclusions. 1. Could it have been prevented if the affidavit had been pursued? 2. What exactly motivated both boys? Grievance, fury, desire for fame, mental illness, or some mix? 3. Did police decisions, especially delays, cost lives, most notably Dave Sanders? 4. Why were the basement tapes destroyed, and what were we denied by that destruction? 5. Have our institutional changes, active shooter training, school hardening, actually reduced risk or simply changed the choreography of violence? Caleb, which of these keeps you up at night?
All of them, but especially the last. We changed surface tactics, useful and necessary, but we haven't found a durable strategy to reduce the incidence of mass shootings. That requires addressing guns, mental health resources, social alienation, online radicalization, the whole ecology. Without systemic investments in prevention and community health, we keep treating symptoms.
I get that. I want to spend a few minutes on the human stories, because a list of policy lessons can feel abstract without faces. Let's talk about Rachel Scott, who was murdered on the Hill. Her story, later mythologized for religious reasons, became a touch point for some who framed her as a martyr based on an interview that later proved partly inaccurate. But she was, plainly, a student with friends, plans, and a life cut short. Same with Dave Sanders, a teacher who directed students to safety and paid with his life. The victims weren't statistics. They were people with futures. Caleb, how should we center victims when discussing systems and perpetrators?
By prioritizing their stories in our framing, by asking what interventions could have preserved lives, and by listening to families about what healing looks like. That means resisting the temptation to focus obsessively on perpetrators, and instead highlighting the long arc of loss and resilience among survivors. Policy must be informed by those lived experiences.
Good. Before we close, I want to touch on legal fallout. Families sued gun suppliers and apportioned blame. There were settlements totaling millions, criminal convictions of people who provided guns to minors, and intense scrutiny of institutional negligence. But legal outcomes can't restore lives. They can, at best, provide some accountability and resources. Caleb, if you could give one piece of practical advice to policymakers trying to prevent future Columbine-like tragedies, what would it be?
Invest in multidisciplinary threat assessment teams in every school district and fund long-term mental health services for adolescents. Early intervention, properly resourced and coordinated with families and law enforcement, reduces risk. It's not glamorous policy, but it's the one most likely to interrupt trajectories like Harris and Klebold's.
Concrete advice from someone who spends his life in this space. I'll add one more. Demand transparency. Families and communities need records and explanations to begin healing. When documents vanish or tapes are destroyed without clear public rationale, trust erodes. Caleb, any final reflections on Columbine's cultural place? Why does it still haunt us more than 2 decades later?
Because it was the moment the myth of suburban safety cracked wide open. It was filmed, recorded, and dramatic in a way other tragedies weren't. It had planning, youth, and a chilling mix of calculated cruelty and teenage anguish. And because it became a template, both as inspiration for later perpetrators and as a cautionary tale for policy, that combination makes it persist.
Persist and demand answers. For listeners who want to dig deeper, we've linked our primary sources and reporting notes in the episode description: the Columbia entries, CBS News coverage on the missing affidavit, timelines, and survivor accounts. Read them with care. These are real lives. Caleb, thank you for your measured, rigorous perspective.
Thank you, Mara. And to everyone listening, take care of each other. And if you hear of threats or troubling behavior, please speak up. It matters.
One last thing before we go. I want to leave listeners with a challenge. Hold the complexity. Resist simplistic narratives that point to a single cause or a single villain. Respect survivor stories. Demand transparency. Push for concrete investments in prevention, mental health, and community supports. Columbine is still unanswered because it resists tidy closure. But that uncertainty obliges us to act, not to look away. This is Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. If you found this episode meaningful, please consider supporting our work or sharing this episode with someone who cares about truth and accountability. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.